Eleanor Monroe pressed her last coin into a child's palm and told herself she wasn't afraid. She was lying. In 3 days, she would marry a man who had already decided she wasn't enough, a duke who'd written to her father calling her a practical arrangement, nothing more. But Eleanor had stopped crying over those words. She'd burned the letter instead. If you've ever been judged before, you were known. Stay with this story until the very end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which James Whitmore would later decide was fitting. Nothing good had ever come to him on a Tuesday. His solicitor, Mr. Aldridge, set the envelope on the desk without a word, which meant it contained something Aldridge himself didn't want to explain. James recognized the handwriting on the outside, his father's steward writing from the Monroe estate in Virginia. He didn't open it immediately. He stood at the window of his Philadelphia townhouse, watching the street below, where a woman was arguing with a cart driver about a wheel that had collapsed against her fence post. The cart driver was winning the argument by being louder. James noted that and said nothing. He opened the letter. It was short. That was the second bad sign. His father's people never wrote short letters unless the news was bad enough. That length would only make it worse. Miss Eleanor Monroe has accepted the terms of the arrangement. She will receive you at Clover Hill on the 14th. Her father asks only that you make no public announcement until after the first meeting, as he believes first impressions between the parties are best formed, without the weight of public expectation. We remain as always in service to the Whitmore family. James set the letter down. He'd agreed to this arrangement 4 months ago, in a moment he now considered one of the weakest of his life. His father had died in February, and the will had contained a condition so archaic, James had assumed it was a clerical error, until 3 different solicitors confirmed it was not. The Whitmore estate, the land, the holdings, the trust, all of it passed to James in full contingent on his marriage, within 18 months of his father's death. If he remained unmarried past that point, the estate would be divided and distributed to a list of charitable institutions his father had apparently spent a decade compiling. James did not begrudge charity. But he was not prepared to lose everything his family had built across 3 generations, because his father had decided from beyond the grave to play matchmaker. So he'd agreed. A name had been presented to him. Monroe, a family of diminished means in Virginia, respectable enough that the arrangement wouldn't embarrass anyone, modest enough that the woman in question would understand clearly what the marriage was. A practical agreement between 2 people who needed something from each other. He had not asked for a portrait. He had not asked for a detailed account of her character. He had asked only one thing of Aldridge, and Aldridge had looked uncomfortable about it. "Find out what she's like when no one important is watching," James had said. Aldridge had shifted in his chair. "How would you have me do that, sir?" "I'll do it myself." He arrived in Virginia on the 12th, 2 days before the scheduled introduction, without announcement, without his own name, and without the carriage that would have made his status immediately obvious to anyone paying attention. He rode in on a plain bay horse he'd borrowed from a man he trusted, wearing a coat that was clean but unremarkable, carrying letters of introduction that identified him as one James Ward, a landowner from Pennsylvania seeking seasonal work to assess conditions in the Virginia soil market before making a purchase decision. It was not technically a lie. He did own land in Pennsylvania. He did intend to assess conditions. The conditions he was assessing were just not agricultural. He found lodgings at a boarding house 2 miles from Clover Hill, run by a woman named Mrs. Patton, who had sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, and who informed him within 15 minutes of his arrival that there was no gambling in the common room, no spirits after 9 o'clock, and no female visitors at any hour, and that if he had a problem with any of those conditions, he was welcome to try his luck at the inn in town, which she described as a place where the sheets were changed when someone notices. James told her the arrangement suited him fine. "You looking for work?" she asked, studying him with the particular assessment of a woman who had spent decades determining whether strangers were going to cause her trouble. "I am," he said. "Clover Hill's taking on some extra hands," she said. "Eleanor Monroe manages most of the daily hiring. Her father's not well. You'd do better to speak to her than to old Thomas Monroe. He means well, but he forgets what he's already agreed to half the time." "Eleanor Monroe," James repeated. Is she the one running things then? Mrs. Patton gave him a look that suggested she found the question slightly foolish. Has been for 2 years, since her mother died and Thomas started failing. Girl doesn't sleep more than 4 hours from what I can tell. Comes into town before first light most days to check on the workers' families before she goes back to manage the estate itself. She paused. She's a good woman, better than most people around here bother to notice. James filed that away. He arrived at Clover Hill the next morning. The estate was not what he had expected. Not because it was poor, he had known the Monroe family's finances were strained, but because it was alive in a way he hadn't anticipated. The land was clean. The fences were maintained. The kitchen garden was tended carefully, and there were children he didn't recognize playing near the well, who clearly felt comfortable enough in the space that they'd been coming for a while. A young man intercepted him near the gate and asked his business. "I'm looking for work," James said. "Mrs. Patton at the boarding house told me to speak to Miss Monroe directly." The young man, no more than 16, with the careful eyes of someone who'd learned young not to trust strangers too quickly, looked him over. "You got any experience with land management? We need someone who can help with the East Field drainage situation. It's technical work." "I can manage it," James said. This was true. He had managed considerably more complicated drainage situations on his own estates. The young man, whose name turned out to be Caleb, and who managed to convey a significant amount of protective instinct for someone who came up to James's shoulder, led him around to the back of the house. Eleanor Monroe was standing in the yard with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, arguing with a man who outweighed her by at least 80 pounds about whether a section of fence could be repaired in place or needed to be pulled and restrung from scratch. She was not what he had expected either. He was not certain what he had expected. Something softer, perhaps. Something more obviously in need of the arrangement his father's will had manufactured. The woman standing in that yard arguing about fence posts with complete authority was none of those things. She was slight, with dark hair that had come half loose from its pins, and she was dirty from what appeared to be actual physical work, and she was absolutely certain she was right about the fence. Which she was. He could see from where he stood that the post was rotted at the base, and the whole section would need to come out. "Miss Monroe," Caleb said. She held up one finger without turning around. "One moment, Caleb." "The post is rotted at the base," she told the large man. "Pull it. If you patch it and leave the post, we'll be back here in 6 weeks having the same argument, except the section will have fallen into the Hargrove property, and we'll owe them an apology on top of the repair." The large man looked like he wanted to argue further. He glanced at the post. He glanced back at her. He made the face of a man who knows he's wrong but doesn't particularly want to say so. "Fine," he said. "Pull it." "Thank you, Mr. Gaines." She said it without a trace of irony. Not victory, just acknowledgement. Then she turned. She looked at James with the same direct assessment Mrs. Patton had used, except younger, and without the settled comfort of a woman who'd been running her own establishment for 30 years. There was something careful in it. Not suspicious exactly, more like someone who had learned to take the measure of people quickly, because making mistakes in that judgment was expensive. "You're looking for work," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Mrs. Patton sent you. She mentioned the East Field drainage issue." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not warmer exactly, but more attentive. "What do you know about drainage?" "Enough to tell you your biggest problem is probably not where you think it is," he said. "If the East Field is holding water, the issue's usually upstream. You're managing the symptom unless you find the source." She was quiet for a moment. "What's your name?" she asked. "James Ward." "Where are you from, Mr. Ward?" "Pennsylvania." "Long way to come looking for day work." "I'm assessing land in the area," he said, "looking to understand the conditions before I commit to a purchase. Mrs. Patton said this area was a good one to learn from." She studied him for another moment. He had the distinct impression she was deciding something, and that the decision was not going to be made any faster by anything he said. "2 weeks," she said finally. "If the drainage issue is what I think it is, it'll take that long to address properly. Room and board covered wages at the going rate. If you find the source and fix it, I'll add a bonus." "That's fair," he said. "I expect work from first light until the light's gone," she said. "Not before. Not after. I don't believe in running people to exhaustion. It makes them careless, and careless people get hurt. But in between, I need full effort." "Understood. Caleb will show you where to put your things." She glanced at the fence post situation where Mr. Gaines was now addressing his error with the energy of a man trying to make the work speak for him. "One more thing, Mr. Ward." "Ma'am." "If you're the kind of man who has trouble taking direction from a woman," she said without particular heat, "I'd rather know now than find out when we're in the middle of something that matters." James looked at her. "I have no difficulty with it," he said. She nodded once, as if filing that answer for later verification. Then she turned back to the fence situation. James spent the first 3 days doing exactly what he'd said he'd do. He walked the east field. He mapped the water table. He traced the drainage channels back toward their origin point and found what he suspected he'd find: a collapsed culvert under the north access road that had been diverting water slowly, quietly, for at least 2 seasons. Nobody had connected it to the East Field problem because nobody had looked far enough upstream. He told Eleanor on the 3rd evening. She listened to the whole explanation without interrupting, which he was not accustomed to. Most people interrupted when they thought they understood where an explanation was going. She waited until he was finished. "How much to fix the culvert?" she asked. He gave her a number. She was quiet for a moment, and he saw the thing he'd seen before: the internal calculation. She was not just calculating cost. She was calculating what else that money was needed for, what could move and what couldn't, how long it would take to do it in stages versus all at once. "Do it in 2 stages, she said. "The culvert first. Then we reassess what the field looks like after 1 growing cycle before committing to the full drainage rework. It'll cost more over time, but it spreads the risk." "That's a sound approach," he said. She looked at him with a flicker of something he couldn't entirely identify. "You sound surprised." "I'm not," he said, which was true, and also a lie, because he had arrived here with a set of assumptions, and she had been quietly dismantling them for 3 days, and he was beginning to understand that the dismantling was going to continue. "Good," she said, and then after a pause, "Mr. Ward, have you eaten?" He had not in fact eaten since midday. "I can manage." "Caleb," she called without looking away from James. "Tell Mrs. Haynes we've got 1 more for supper." A distant acknowledgement came from somewhere inside the house. "You don't need to," James started. "No," she agreed. "I don't need to. Sit down, Mr. Ward." He sat down. Supper at Clover Hill was not what he had expected either. There were 8 people at the table. Eleanor. Her father, Thomas Monroe, who was a tall man, gone thin at the edges, with the careful movements of someone managing pain he preferred not to discuss. Caleb. Mrs. Haynes, who cooked and also apparently held opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. 2 farmhands whose names were Eli and George, who were brothers and argued companionably about everything. And 2 others, a woman called Martha, who was perhaps 30 and had the hands of someone who'd done hard labor for many years, and a boy of about 6, who was clearly Martha's son, who sat beside her and watched everyone at the table with enormous quiet eyes. James learned without asking directly that Martha's husband had died in the spring, and that Eleanor had arranged for her to stay on at Clover Hill, nominally as a household helper, but clearly as much for the accommodation as anything else. He learned this because Mr. Monroe said over the bread, "Martha, that boy of yours ate 3 rolls yesterday. Mrs. Haynes told me." Martha looked uncertain, as if she wasn't sure whether she was in trouble. "That's exactly right," Eleanor said without missing a beat. "He's growing. Mrs. Haynes makes sure there's extra bread tomorrow." "Already planned," Mrs. Haynes said. Thomas Monroe caught James watching and gave him the faint smile of a man who understood that a stranger was recalibrating something. "My daughter runs a generous house, Mr. Ward," he said. "I take full credit for raising her right and accept no responsibility for anything that goes wrong." There was laughter around the table. Even Martha smiled. Eleanor across from James was cutting bread with a focus that suggested she'd rather not be the subject of the observation. "Papa," she said. "I am simply accurate," Thomas Monroe said mildly. At 10. On the 5th day, James saw the thing that he could not stop thinking about afterward. He'd been working near the tree line at the edge of the property, checking the secondary drainage channel, when he heard voices. He didn't make himself visible. He wasn't hiding exactly. He just didn't announce himself, because the voices were coming from the direction of the road, and something in the tone made him stop. 2 women from town. He didn't know their names yet. They were well dressed in the relative measure of the area, and speaking with the particular confidence of people who've never had to worry about whether anyone was listening. "I saw her in town again this morning," one said, "before 6 o'clock, bringing bread to the Calloway family." "Of course she was," the other said, and the tone was not admiring. "She makes very sure to be seen doing it. The Calloways don't have anyone watching at 6 in the morning. Someone always sees. She knows what she's doing. You think it's an act. I think a woman in her position trying to secure a wealthy husband knows exactly how to appear charitable. I've seen this before. They perform generosity when it benefits them." The voices moved on down the road. James stayed where he was for a long moment. He thought about the bread at 5 in the morning, and the Calloway family, whoever they were, and whether there was anyone watching at that hour. He thought about Martha's son eating 3 rolls. He thought about Eleanor cutting bread at the supper table with that focused, uncomfortable expression, while her father gave her credit she clearly didn't want, given in front of a stranger. He went back to work. But he made a note in his mind to be up before 6 the following morning. Batman. He was. He didn't follow her. That felt like a violation of something he was unwilling to cross. He simply positioned himself finishing some work he'd left incomplete near the road, where he could see without being seen. She walked to town in the dark. Alone. Carrying a basket. She was back before full light, empty-handed, moving quickly back toward the house, because there was work to be done. Nobody saw her go. Nobody saw her come back. The women from the road had been wrong about the audience. There was no audience. That was the entire point. James spent the rest of that day considerably less comfortable than he had been when he arrived. On the 7th day, the thing happened that he hadn't planned for. He'd been in the barn working on a piece of equipment when he heard Eleanor's voice from the yard, a different tone than he'd heard her use before. Shorter, controlled in a way that suggested the control was costing her something. He stepped to the barn door. There were 2 men on horseback in the yard. He didn't recognize them. Eleanor was standing in front of them with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and even from that distance, James could see the particular stillness of someone who was choosing very deliberately not to show what they were feeling. "The offer stands at the same number," one of the men said. He was well dressed, with the ease of someone used to having things go his direction. "Your father knows the position you're in. This land isn't worth what you think it is in its current condition." "My father's position is his own to speak to," Eleanor said. "I'll tell you, as I've told you before, Mr. Crawford, that this land isn't for sale." "You've got debt, Miss Monroe." "Most people do." "You've got a fiancée who hasn't made any public commitment yet," Crawford said, and his tone shifted into something James didn't like at all. "A man in his position with his options, I wouldn't be counting on that arrangement as a solution if I were you." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for your concern about my arrangements," she said. "I'll see you off the property now." Crawford looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that was meant to make a person feel very small and very certain that what they were fighting for was already lost. "It's a fair offer," he said. "Don't be foolish." "Good day, Mr. Crawford." They left. Eleanor stood in the yard after they'd gone. She didn't move for a long moment. Her hands at her sides were shaking just slightly, just enough that you'd miss it if you weren't watching carefully. Then she breathed in, and she went back into the house. James stepped back into the barn. He stood there in the dimness, with the sound of the horses fading down the road, and he thought about Crawford's voice, and the offer, and the particular cruelty of reminding a woman in a difficult position that the thing she was counting on might not materialize. He thought about what Eleanor had said to him on the first day. "If you're the kind of man who has trouble taking direction from a woman, I'd rather know now." She hadn't said it as a challenge. She'd said it as a genuine question, because she needed to know, because she was managing too much and couldn't afford to waste time on someone who was going to make it harder. He thought about that for a very long time. On the 9th day, Caleb said out of absolutely nowhere while they were working on the culvert repair, she was supposed to marry someone 2 years ago. James looked at him. Caleb shrugged with the studied casualness of someone who's been wanting to say something and has been looking for a natural opening. Her father arranged it. Man named Harrington from a good family. Had money. Eleanor seemed to think it was reasonable, even if she didn't seem particularly happy about it. "What happened?" James asked. "He met someone else," Caleb said. "Someone with more money. He ended the arrangement. In writing. Very formal." He paused, adjusting the tool in his hand. "I was in the room when she read the letter. She didn't cry. She just folded it up and put it in her pocket and said she needed to get back to work. She didn't say anything else. She said one thing." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "She said, 'I remember this exact,'" she said. "Well, at least now I know what I was worth to him." James looked at the culvert. "She never said anything bad about him," Caleb added. "Not once. I've heard other people say things about him. She never did. She just moved on." He said the last 2 words with the particular emphasis of someone who understood that moving on had not been simple and who wanted to make sure that was not missed. On the 11th day, the thing James had been dreading happened. His solicitor arrived. Aldridge appeared at the Clover Hill gate in the late afternoon in the distinctive Whitmore carriage, which James had specifically instructed him not to bring, looking harassed and speaking to Caleb in the urgent undertones of someone who had been traveling for 2 days and had urgent business and was not accustomed to being intercepted at gates by 16-year-olds. James saw the carriage from the east field. He walked quickly. Not running. Walking quickly. He reached the gate just as Eleanor came out of the house. She looked at the carriage. She looked at the crest on the door. She looked at James. He watched her face as the pieces assembled themselves. He'd seen Eleanor Monroe quiet in calculation before. He'd seen her still in the face of things that were difficult. He had not seen this, the very specific stillness of someone who has just understood something and is deciding how to respond to it while the ground moves under them. "Aldridge," James said, "go back to the boarding house. I'll come this evening." Aldridge looked between them. He had the expression of a man who understood he had made a significant error. "Sir, this evening," James said. Aldridge looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at James. Aldridge very wisely said nothing else and directed the driver to turn around. The carriage left. The yard was quiet. "Mr. Ward," Eleanor said, and her voice was even, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't been. "Or I suppose I should ask, what is your name?" James looked at her. "James Whitmore," he said. She absorbed that. "Duke of—" "Yes." She was quiet for a very long moment. He watched her hands. They were not shaking the way they had been after Crawford's visit. They were absolutely still, which he was beginning to understand was more serious. "You've been here 11 days, she said. "Yes." "Working in my fields?" "Yes." "Eating at my table?" "Yes." "Watching me?" Not an accusation, a statement, careful and precise. "Yes," he said, because there was nothing else to say. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said very quietly, with the same tone she'd used when she told Crawford good day, "I'd like you to go inside and wait in my father's study. I'll be in shortly." "Eleanor." "Please don't," she said, not angry, not breaking, something much more contained and much more devastating than either. "Not right now. Please just go wait." He went. She made him wait for 40 minutes. He knew because he counted. When she came in, she was clean. She'd washed her face, changed her dress, pinned her hair properly. She sat across from him in her father's study in the chair that was clearly her chair, not the guest chair, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with eyes that were very bright and very dry. "Tell me why," she said. "My father's will required that I marry within 18 months of his death," James said. "Your family was proposed as a suitable match. I agreed to meet you. Before I did, I wanted to understand whether I was after your money," she said. He didn't look away. "Yes." She absorbed that. "And what did you determine?" "That you were not." She held his gaze. "And now you feel you owe me an explanation." "I owe you considerably more than an explanation. What you owe me," Eleanor said with a precision that was more devastating than anger, "is to understand what you did. You came into my home. You ate at my table. You worked alongside the people I am responsible for. You watched me, and you didn't see a person, Mr. Whitmore. You saw evidence. You were collecting evidence about whether I was worthy of something you were already predisposed to withhold." James was quiet. "Every person who has ever judged me has at least had the honesty to do it from a distance," she said. "They looked at my family's finances, or my mother's absence, or the state of this land, and they decided what I was from the outside. You—" She stopped, breathed. "You sat at my table. You let me tell you things. You let me think—" She stopped again. "Eleanor," he said. "Miss Monroe," she said not harshly. As a correction, a necessary precision. "Miss Monroe." He leaned forward. "Everything I saw, everything I observed, and I will not pretend I didn't come here with that intention, changed what I believed, not just about you, about myself, about the kind of man I'd become." "What kind of man is that?" "One who assumed the worst," he said. "One who decided he already knew what people were before he'd spent 5 minutes with them. My father made a poor marriage for money, and it broke him. I spent 20 years deciding that meant everyone who needed something was only after what they could take. I decided that before I ever met you, I arrived here already certain of what I'd find." He paused. "I was wrong about all of it. I am telling you that plainly because I don't think you want anything except plainness right now." She looked at him for a very long time. "You were wrong about all of it," she said. "Yes. And in 11 days of being wrong, you fixed my drainage culvert." There was something in her voice on that last sentence. Not quite humor. Not yet. But something adjacent to it that told him she was still there. Still the woman who'd argued about fence posts on that first morning and been completely right. "I did," he said. She looked at her hands, then at him. "My father expects to meet you properly on the 14th. That is tomorrow. I imagine that meeting is going to be complicated." "Yes." "He likes you," she said. "He told me last night he thought you were a good man. He said you worked without being watched, which he said was the only reliable measure of a person's character." James said nothing. "I am not telling you that to make you feel better," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you because it's relevant to what comes next, and you should have accurate information." She looked up. "I haven't decided yet, Mr. Whitmore, about any of it. I want you to understand that clearly." "I understand it," he said. "What I ask," she said, "is that from this point forward, you do not make a single decision that affects me, not one, without telling me the truth first. Can you do that?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. She looked at him for a long time. "All right," she said finally. She stood. "Supper is at 6. You know where the table is." She walked to the door, and then with her hand on the frame and her back to him, she said, "The fence post you told Gaines to check on the south property line, the one you said looked uncertain." "Yes." "It was rotted at the base," she said. "Same as the East Field one. We pulled it this morning." She walked out. James sat in her father's study, in the silence she left behind, and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has been comprehensively wrong about something important, that the next thing he did was going to matter enormously. He also understood for the first time in a very long time that he very much wanted to do it right. Supper on the 13th was the strangest meal James Whitmore had ever sat through in his life, and he had once attended a dinner in Philadelphia where two sitting congressmen had nearly come to blows over a tariff dispute before the soup course. This was worse. Thomas Monroe knew. Eleanor had told her father before supper James didn't know exactly what she'd said. But when Thomas Monroe came to the table, he looked at James with the measuring eyes of a man reassembling everything he'd believed about a person from the ground up. He didn't say anything about it. He sat. He passed the bread. He asked Eli about the south fence repair. He made a remark to Mrs. Haynes about the stew that made her laugh. And through all of it, every few minutes, he looked at James with those eyes. Caleb knew something was wrong. He was too sharp not to feel the current running under the meal, even if he couldn't identify its source. He ate quietly, which was unusual for him, and watched Eleanor with the particular attention of someone who has decided they are on a person's side, and is waiting to understand what that's going to require of them. Martha's boy, who had no idea anything was wrong, ate 4 rolls. James ate what was in front of him and said very little and paid attention to everything. After supper, Thomas Monroe said, "Mr. Whitmore, walk with me." Not Mr. Ward. Whitmore. Eleanor looked at her father. Something passed between them, a conversation without words, the particular shorthand of two people who have been each other's closest company for a long time. Thomas Monroe's expression said, "I need to do this." Eleanor's said, "I know." "Be careful." James followed Thomas Monroe out of the house. They walked toward the east field which James had spent the better part of 2 weeks repairing, and Thomas Monroe walked steadily with the cane he hadn't used at supper, and said nothing for a long enough stretch that James understood he was being allowed to feel the silence. "She told me you fixed the culvert problem," Thomas Monroe said finally. "Yes, sir." "Traced it back to the north access road. Nobody else thought to look that far. It wasn't complicated, just required following it upstream." Thomas Monroe nodded slowly. "That's a good way to solve most problems, I find. Follow them back far enough, and you usually find something simpler than you expected." He paused. "My daughter is not a complicated person, Mr. Whitmore. She is a thorough one. There is a difference." "I've noticed that," James said. "What else have you noticed?" It was a direct question from a man who had decided that directness was the only appropriate response to a situation this unusual. James thought about what to say, and then decided that anything except the complete truth was the wrong choice. "I noticed that she works harder than anyone I've employed on any of my properties," James said. "I noticed that she makes decisions the way an engineer does, not by instinct but by tracing causes. I noticed that she is kinder than most people I have encountered, and that she does not appear to find this remarkable. I noticed that she was handed a serious difficulty when that man Crawford came, and she managed it without letting it show until they were gone. And then she allowed herself 30 seconds before she went back to work." Thomas Monroe was quiet for a moment. "You saw Crawford," he said. "I was in the barn." Thomas Monroe made a sound that was not quite a sigh. "He's been after this land for 3 years. Since Eleanor's mother died and word got out that we'd had some reverses." He paused. "He's not wrong that we're in a difficult position. He's just wrong about what the appropriate response to that is." "What's the appropriate response?" "To manage it," Thomas Monroe said simply. "Same as anything else. You find the source. You address it upstream." He glanced sideways at James. "My daughter has been managing it, mostly without my help because I have not always been able to provide it. That is a fact I do not enjoy, but I have stopped pretending it isn't true, because pretending things aren't true is a luxury I find I can no longer afford." They stopped walking. "Why did you come here this way?" Thomas Monroe asked. Not angry, genuinely asking. James told him the truth. The whole truth: his father's failed marriage, the will, the 18 months, the decision to come anonymously, the assumption he'd arrived with. Thomas Monroe listened to all of it without interrupting. When James finished, Thomas Monroe said, "And what assumption did you arrive with specifically?" "That any woman in Eleanor's position would marry for security," James said. "That her goodness would be performed, that I would find the performance if I watched long enough." And instead, I found that she delivers bread before sunrise to a family she has no obligation to, and no one sees her do it." James paused. "And she fixed a fence post I mentioned in passing 3 days ago because the information was useful, not because I was there to notice she'd acted on it." Thomas Monroe nodded slowly. "She doesn't need to be seen doing the right thing," he said. "She never has. Her mother was the same. It used to frustrate me when she was small. I'd want to praise her for something, and she'd look at me like I'd misunderstood the entire point." Something in his voice shifted. "She needs someone who understands that about her, not someone who rewards her for it, someone who just understands it." James was quiet. "I owe her an honest accounting," he said, "of what I did and what I assumed and what I now understand I was wrong about. I have begun that. I don't expect it to resolve quickly." "No," Thomas Monroe agreed. "It won't." He began walking back toward the house. "She'll meet with you properly tomorrow as scheduled. Whatever she decides, I'll support it, including if she decides the arrangement isn't one she's willing to continue." "That's fair," James said. Thomas Monroe stopped walking once more. "One more thing, Mr. Whitmore." "Sir?" "The work you did on that culvert," Thomas Monroe said. "Eli tells me it was the best repair he's seen on this property in 15 years. Clean work, done right the first time." He paused. "My daughter noticed that too. She didn't say so, but she noticed." He went inside. James stood in the dark for a while thinking about clean work and first impressions and the particular cost of being wrong. The formal meeting on the 14th was by any measure the strangest introduction James had ever participated in. They sat in the Monroe parlor, Thomas Monroe, Eleanor, and James, in the polite arrangement of people conducting a meeting they had technically already been having in a barn and a kitchen and a field for 11 days. Mrs. Haynes had put out tea. Caleb was conspicuously absent, which told James that Eleanor had told him to make himself scarce, and that he had complied while making it obvious he was not happy about it. Thomas Monroe did most of the formal speaking. He covered the arrangement, the terms his father's solicitor had proposed, the timeline. He spoke clearly and without embarrassment about the family's financial difficulties, which James found he respected enormously. It would have been easy to minimize it, to wrap it in language that obscured the reality, and Thomas Monroe chose not to. Eleanor sat with her hands folded and listened to her father speak about her circumstances with the stillness James had come to recognize as her version of careful management. She was not going to show anything until she knew what she was dealing with. James let Thomas Monroe finish. Then he said, "Mr. Monroe, may I speak with your daughter directly?" Thomas Monroe looked at Eleanor. Eleanor, after a moment, nodded. "I'll be in the study," Thomas Monroe said. He took his tea and went. James and Eleanor sat in the parlor, with the sound of the house around them. Mrs. Haynes in the kitchen. Something in the yard that was probably Eli, the particular creaking of a house that had been standing long enough to have opinions about weather. "You could have simply introduced yourself on the first day," Eleanor said. "Not an accusation, an observation." "Yes," James said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I had already decided who you were," he said. "And introducing myself as the Duke of Whitmore on the first day would have changed your behavior. I would have seen what you chose to show me, not what was actually there." He paused. That reasoning was sound. The assumption underneath it was not. Eleanor considered that. The assumption being that there was something to uncover, that what was actually there would be worse than the performance. He looked at her. "I was wrong." She was quiet for a moment. "Tell me what you saw," she said. "Not what you concluded, what you actually saw." So he told her. He told her about the bread delivery before sunrise, about the fence post she'd pulled without mentioning it, about Martha's son eating 4 rolls, and her instruction to Mrs. Haynes to make extra. About the way she'd managed Crawford, the stillness, the precision, the 30 seconds after they'd ridden out. He told her about the women on the road who'd said she was performing. Eleanor was very still when he said that. "I heard them," he said, "and I watched the bread delivery the next morning." There was no one watching, no one on the road, no one from town who would have seen it and reported it back to the people whose opinions you might have wanted. He paused. You did it in the dark. Eleanor looked at her hands. I don't do it to be seen, she said, very quietly. I know that now. I know you know it, she said. That's not... She stopped, started again. What I mean is that what you described the women on the road, I know those women. I know what they think of me. I've known it for years. And there is a particular exhaustion in doing something because it matters, and having other people assume it must have a hidden motive because in their experience, everything has a hidden motive. Yes, James said. I was doing the same thing, from closer in. She looked at him then. Yes, she said. You were. They sat with that for a moment. Here is what I need to understand, Eleanor said. The arrangement the terms of your father's will do, they require a specific woman, or simply a marriage. Simply a marriage. Then you could marry anyone. Yes. But you're here. Yes. After 11 days of watching me manage a drainage culvert and argue about fence posts, she said. And there it was not quite humor, but its clear cousin showing up at the edge of her voice. Those are not the only things I observed, James said. No, she agreed. I suppose they're not. She was quiet for a moment. I need to tell you something plainly, Mr. Whitmore, and I need you to hear it as information rather than as something requiring a response. All right. I have been in one arrangement before, she said. You may know this. The man decided he'd made an error and communicated that in writing. Very formally. He had his solicitor send the letter. She said this without visible distress, with the same precision she brought to drainage problems and fence post assessments. I read the letter, and I put it away, and I went back to work. But what I felt was not simply hurt. What I felt was clarified. Like something I'd half believed about my own worth had been confirmed by a person in a position to make that judgment. James said nothing. He had learned in 11 days that Eleanor Monroe's silences were worth respecting. I am telling you that, she said, because I want you to understand that what you did coming here in disguise with the explicit purpose of determining my worth landed on ground that was already damaged. And I need you to know that not because I want your sympathy, but because it affects what I am and am not capable of right now. What are you capable of? He asked. She thought about it seriously. Continuing to be honest with you, giving this arrangement a fair consideration, not punishing you for the deception by refusing to see what came after it. She paused. What I am not capable of currently is trust. That will have to be built. I understand that. It will take time. I have time, he said. My father's will gives me 18 months. We are at 4. I am in no hurry. She looked at him with that assessing quality. You would stay in Virginia. I would need to return to Philadelphia periodically. But yes, I would stay. Working the East Field isn't required, she said. You've more than addressed the drainage situation. I'm aware it isn't required. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust, but its possibility which was different and in some ways more significant. There is a second problem with the North Access Road, she said. Beyond the culvert. I noticed it when Eli and I were doing the repair. The roadbed is compromised in 2 places, and if we have a wet autumn, it will become impassable before winter. I'd need to look at it, James said. Yes, Eleanor said. You would. He looked at it the next morning. He also, while he was looking at it, made a decision about Crawford. Crawford had come to this property twice in the past 2 weeks, once while James was watching, and once Caleb told him a week before his arrival, when he'd managed to corner Thomas Monroe alone and make his offer in terms that Thomas had found distressing enough that he'd been quieter than usual for several days after. The man wasn't going to stop. He had money and patience, and the particular confidence of someone who believed that everyone had a price, and that time was on his side. James spent the evening writing 3 letters. One to his solicitor in Philadelphia, one to a land assessor he trusted in Richmond, and one to a man he knew in the Virginia legislature, who had strong opinions about land speculation practices, and even stronger opinions about people who tried to capitalize on vulnerable families. He did not tell Eleanor he was writing them. He told her 4 days later when the responses had come back and he had something concrete to report. She was in the kitchen with Mrs. Haynes when he found her early morning, and he said, "I have something to tell you. Something I did without asking you first, and I need you to know about it before it becomes relevant." Eleanor put down what she was holding and looked at him. He told her about the letters. All 3 of them. What he'd asked for, what he'd received in response. The land assessor had confirmed that the Monroe property was significantly undervalued by Crawford's offer. The Eastfield drainage improvement alone had raised it considerably. The legislative contact had mentioned in careful language that Crawford had made similar approaches to 3 other distressed families in the past 2 years, and that there was a growing interest in those activities among certain people in Richmond. Eleanor listened to all of this. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "I should have. I'm telling you now. You made contact with people in Richmond about my family's land without asking me." "Yes. That's the same instinct as before," she said. "Moving pieces without including me." The words landed. He felt them land. He did not defend himself. "You're right," he said. "I acted on the problem because I saw a problem and I have resources that address it, and I moved without thinking about whether that was mine to do. I am sorry." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "The land assessor's report," she said. "Can I see it?" He handed it to her. She read it. He watched her read it. He watched the particular quality of her attention when she got to the valuation section, something tightening and then releasing like a person discovering that a burden they'd been carrying was lighter than they'd been told. "Significantly undervalued," she said, "by a substantial margin." She folded the report carefully. "This changes our position with Crawford considerably." "Yes." "And the information from Richmond. Also useful. If Crawford escalates, it creates a record." Eleanor nodded slowly. Then she said, "Next time you want to write letters to people in Richmond about my family's land, ask me first." "Yes," he said. "I may want to write them myself." "That would be better," he said. She almost smiled. It was a very small almost smile, and it lasted less than a second, but it was there. 3 days later, Crawford came back. This time James was in the yard when the horses appeared on the road, and he did not go into the barn. Crawford saw him. Whatever he'd expected to find at Clover Hill on this visit, it was not a man standing in the yard who looked back at him with the particular stillness of someone who has no anxiety about what's coming. Crawford dismounted. He looked at James. He did the recalibration that people did when they encountered someone whose presence they hadn't accounted for. "Who are you?" Crawford said. "James Whitmore," James said. Crawford went still. "I see," Crawford said after a moment. "Miss Monroe is inside," James said. "If you have business with the family, you can state it to me, and I'll determine whether she needs to be involved. If your business is regarding the land, I can tell you now that the valuation situation has changed materially since your last offer, and I'd recommend having your assessor take another look before making any further proposals." Crawford stared at him. "You're the—" "Yes. You're here." As you can see. Crawford looked at the house. He looked back at James. He was a man accustomed to calculating odds, and he was calculating them now, and the numbers were not in his favor, and he knew it. "Give my regards to Miss Monroe," Crawford said. He got back on his horse. He rode away. James watched him go, and thought about Eleanor in the yard after Crawford's last visit. The hands at her sides. The shaking, she wouldn't let anyone see the 30 seconds she allowed herself before going back to work. He thought about 3 years of that. 3 years of Crawford showing up with his careful threats and his offers built on the premise that no one was coming to help. Someone had. A little late, but someone had. He turned to go back inside and found Eleanor standing in the doorway. She had seen the whole thing. He understood that immediately. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "You told him the valuation had changed." It seemed like the relevant information. "He'll check," she said. "I'm counting on it. Once he sees the number, he'll move on. There are easier targets." Eleanor was quiet. Then she said very carefully, as if testing the weight of the words, "Thank you." It was the first time she'd thanked him for anything. In 2 weeks of meals and drainage repairs and fence posts and the formal parlor meeting, she had been civil and precise and occasionally something approaching warm, but she had not said those 2 words. James understood what they cost her. "You're welcome," he said. Simple, without enlarging it. She stepped back to let him inside, and as he passed her in the doorway, she said quietly, not quite to him, "I am beginning to think you might be a different kind of man than I assumed." He stopped. "I assumed a great many things about you when this started," he said. "I don't think either of us should be too comfortable with our early assumptions." The almost smile came back, stayed a fraction longer this time. "No," she said. "I suppose not." The following Sunday, Eleanor went to the Calloway family before sunrise, same as every week. This time when she came back, James was sitting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee, because he had been up anyway, and Mrs. Haynes had shown him where everything was. Eleanor stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at him. "I'm not watching you," he said. "I'm having coffee." "You knew I'd be back at this time." "Yes." She looked at the second cup. "Mrs. Haynes showed me where everything was," he said. Eleanor came up the steps. She sat. She took the second cup and wrapped her hands around it. The morning was cool enough that the warmth mattered, and she held it the way someone holds something that they needed more than they expected to. "The Calloway family," he said. Not a question, not an inquiry, just the acknowledgement that he knew. "Daniel Calloway broke his leg in the spring," she said. "He can't work. They have 5 children. The oldest is 12. She paused. "People around here know. A few have helped. Most haven't." "Why not?" She thought about it. "Because helping someone who's struggling feels uncomfortable," she said. "Like if you look at it too closely, you might have to think about how close you are to being in the same position." She looked at her coffee. "It's easier to believe that struggling people have done something to deserve it. Then, you don't have to feel responsible." James was quiet for a moment. "You don't believe that?" "No," she said. "I believe most people are one bad season from needing the same kindness they won't extend." She paused. "My family's had its bad seasons. I know what it looks like when someone brings bread and doesn't make you feel small about needing it." He heard the specific history in that not told directly, but present. Someone had brought bread once. Someone had handled it in a way that didn't diminish the Monroes. Eleanor had been a child, probably, and she had remembered. "Did your mother teach you that?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "You're observant." "Occasionally." "Yes," she said. "She did." She was quiet for a moment. "She died when I was 22. She'd been sick for 2 years before that. I think I'd been taking over the daily things for long enough that it didn't feel like a sudden change. It was just gradual. And then she was gone, and I was already doing what needed doing." "That must have been lonely," he said. She considered that. "Yes," she said. "It was. It still is sometimes." She looked at him with a directness that was starting to feel familiar. "Is that strange to admit to a man I've known for 2 weeks?" "You've been honest with me more consistently than most people I've known for years," he said. She nodded slowly. "I stopped seeing the point in performing when Harrington sent his letter," she said. "Whatever I performed, it wasn't enough, so I stopped." She looked at the morning. "I decided I'd rather be exactly who I am and have people leave on honest grounds than adjust myself and lose them on false ones." James thought about that for a long moment. He thought about the women on the road and Crawford and the formal parlor meeting and the bread in the dark, and all of it adding up to a person who had decided that honesty was the only economy she could afford. "For what it's worth, he said, "who you are is considerably more than enough." She didn't respond immediately. Then she said, "That is either the truest thing you've said to me or the most practiced." "I have no practice at this," he said. "I have spent 10 years ensuring that I never needed any." She looked at him. Why? Because I decided the same way you decided something after Harrington's letter, that it was easier not to try. He paused. My father's marriage ended badly. I watched it end. I decided marriage was a transaction, and that treating it as anything else was how people got hurt. He looked at the morning. I was not wrong about the hurt. I was wrong about the solution. Eleanor held her coffee cup and didn't say anything. I'm telling you that, he said, because you told me something honest this morning, and I think that deserves an honest thing in return. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the sky changed color slightly, the particular slow shift of early morning light. You said you have time, she said finally. In Virginia. I do. Then stay, she said. Not as a worker, not as a disguised observer. Just stay. Be here. Let me know who you actually are the same way you've been watching who I actually am. James looked at her. That's fair, he said. I know it's fair, Eleanor said with a flicker of something that was nearly humor and nearly warmth and entirely its own thing. I'm the one proposing it. The morning opened up around them. Mrs. Haynes could be heard inside beginning the work of breakfast. Somewhere out in the yard, Eli and George were starting their habitual argument about something that wouldn't be resolved before supper. James Whitmore sat on the porch of a house that wasn't his, with a woman who had every reason to have sent him away, and thought that for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He didn't say that. He just finished his coffee, and when Eleanor stood to go in and begin her day, he stood too, and went with her, and the morning went on. 3 weeks after Crawford rode away and didn't come back, James received a letter from Philadelphia that changed everything. He read it twice at the kitchen table, before Eleanor came in, and by the time she appeared in the doorway, with her hair still half-pinned and her boots already on, because she'd been up checking on the south field drainage before breakfast. He had folded it twice and set it face down on the table, and was sitting with his hands flat on either side of it, like he was trying to keep it from moving. Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked at the letter. Bad news travels in envelopes, she said. Sit down, he said. She sat. She didn't reach for the letter. She waited, which was something he'd come to understand was one of her particular disciplines, the capacity to wait, without performing impatience, without filling silence with noise just to manage her own discomfort. My father's will has a second condition, James said. One Aldridge apparently failed to communicate to me with adequate clarity when we first reviewed the document. Eleanor's hands were still on the table. The marriage, James said, must be approved by the remaining members of the Whitmore family council. There are 3. My father's brother, my cousin, and a woman named Mrs. Hargrove, who is my father's sister, and who has held an opinion about every decision made in the Whitmore family for the past 40 years. And they must approve the match, Eleanor said. In person. There is to be a formal introduction in Philadelphia, within 60 days of a formal engagement being declared. Eleanor was very quiet. They don't know about you, James said. They know an arrangement was being considered. They don't know I've been here. They don't know anything about who you are. Or who I'm not, Eleanor said, which is what they'll be more interested in. He didn't deny it. My uncle is a reasonable man. My cousin follows his father's lead, Mrs. Hargrove. He stopped. Tell me about Mrs. Hargrove, Eleanor said. James looked at her. She opposed every marriage in the family that she didn't personally arrange, he said, including my father's, which she was right about. She has not forgiven herself for being right about it and wrong about the method. She believes that social standing is the only reliable predictor of a person's character, and she has spent 60 years being occasionally correct about that in ways that have convinced her she's always correct about it. Eleanor absorbed this. She will not find my family's social standing satisfactory. No. Or our financial position. No. And she has the authority to withhold approval. Technically, the council operates by majority. My uncle and cousin would likely follow my lead if I presented the case well. Mrs. Hargrove... He paused. Mrs. Hargrove is the problem. Eleanor stood up. She went to the window. She stood there with her back to him, and he watched her shoulders and the quality of stillness she was holding, which was different from her usual stillness. This one had something under it. "Eleanor," he said. "I'm thinking," she said. He waited. "When would we need to go?" she said. Something in his chest did a thing he didn't expect. She'd said we. "Within the month," he said. "If we're to make the 60-day window from a formal declaration." She turned around. "Then we have two problems," she said. "The first is that we have not made a formal declaration, and I am not certain I'm prepared to make one on a timeline someone else has set." "I know." "The second is that I have never been to Philadelphia. I have never been introduced to a family council of any kind. And if Mrs. Hargrove is the kind of woman who makes judgments based on social standing before she's exchanged 20 words with a person, I am going to need to understand her considerably better than I do right now before I walk into a room with her." James looked at her. "You'd still consider going?" "I didn't say I wouldn't consider it," Eleanor said. "I said I'm not prepared to make a formal declaration on a timeline I didn't set." She came back to the table. She picked up the letter. She read it. Her eyes moved quickly and thoroughly the way they always did when she was taking in new information. "Your uncle's name is Robert." "Yes." "He approved the initial arrangement proposal." "He did. Which means he's not opposed in principle." She set the letter down. "What would you need from me to make the introduction viable?" James said, honestly. "Always." "Nothing," he said. "You would not need to be anything other than what you are. The question is whether who you are is something Mrs. Hargrove is capable of seeing." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. "And if she isn't, then I override the council," he said. "The will requires approval. It does not specify consequences if that approval is withheld by one member based on criteria I consider unreasonable." "You've had a solicitor look at that language?" "I had 3 solicitors look at it the morning after Aldridge delivered the letter." Something moved across Eleanor's face, not quite a smile, but the thing behind a smile. "Of course you did," she said quietly. They sat with the problem between them, like a thing that needed to be properly assessed before it could be addressed. James understood watching her that Eleanor Monroe was doing something very specific. She was not panicking, and she was not capitulating, and she was not pretending the problem was smaller than it was. She was measuring it, finding its dimensions, looking for the upstream source. "Tell me everything you know about Mrs. Hargrove," Eleanor said. "Not just that she disapproves of things. Tell me why." So James told her. He told her about Margaret Hargrove over the next 3 evenings in installments, because the full accounting was complicated, and Eleanor asked questions that required him to go back and find earlier pieces of the story to answer properly. What emerged was a portrait that James himself had never fully assembled before, because he had never needed to, and because when someone is a fixed element of your landscape, you stop examining the reasons they're standing where they are. Margaret Hargrove had been the most accomplished woman of her generation in the Whitmore social circle. She'd spoken 3 languages, managed her own household's finances with a precision that had made her husband's business partners uncomfortable, and had opinions about architecture law and agricultural reform that she had expressed in considerable detail in letters to people who mostly didn't write back. She had married a respectable man who had died young and left her comfortable but childless. She had then spent the next 4 decades expressing her intelligence through the management of other people's decisions because there was no other outlet available to a woman of her era and standing. And that was the part James had never examined before the part Eleanor got to in the second evening. "She's not malicious," Eleanor said. "She can be," James said. "She's frustrated," Eleanor said. "She's a woman who could have run a business, sat on a legislative committee, managed an estate as complicated as any man in her circle, and instead she spent her life in rooms where the only power available to her was approval or disapproval of other people's choices." She paused. "That doesn't make her right, but it makes her comprehensible." James sat with that. "If she walks into a room expecting to disapprove of me," Eleanor said, And I try to meet her expectations for social standing or accomplishment in those terms, I'll lose. She'll see through it. She's too intelligent not to. What's the alternative? Eleanor thought about it. I don't try to meet her expectations. I try to meet her. She looked at him. Is there any way to have a conversation with her before the formal introduction not arranged? Informal. James stared at her. You want to meet Margaret Hargrove informally. I want to have a conversation with a woman who is more capable than she's been allowed to demonstrate, Eleanor said, before she's in a room where her role is to judge me. That, James said, is the most unexpected thing you've said to me since you told me to wait in your father's study. Is it possible? She asked. He thought about it. Margaret corresponds with a woman in Virginia, he said slowly. A Mrs. Weston in Richmond. They've exchanged letters for years, met once at a gathering in Philadelphia, and apparently found each other intellectually compatible, which for Margaret is extraordinary. She almost never finds anyone intellectually compatible. Eleanor filed that away. James did not yet understand exactly what she was planning, but he had spent enough time watching Eleanor Monroe solve problems upstream to know that he should not underestimate what came next. The formal declaration happened on a Wednesday morning in the Monroe parlor, with Thomas Monroe present as witness. It was not, James reflected afterward, like any formal declaration he'd imagined when he was younger. It was not romantic in the conventional sense. Eleanor sat across from him with her hands folded and said, I want to be clear about what I'm agreeing to and what I'm not. I am agreeing to present this arrangement for the family council's consideration. I am not agreeing that their approval determines the final outcome. That remains my decision. Agreed, James said. I am agreeing to go to Philadelphia. I am not agreeing to perform anything I am not. I wouldn't ask that. You wouldn't mean to ask it, she said. But Philadelphia is not Virginia, and the pressures will be different, and I want it said plainly now that if I feel I'm being managed into performing something I'm not, I'll say so. You'll say so to me specifically. To you first, she said, and then to whoever needs to hear it. Thomas Monroe from his chair in the corner made a sound that might have been amusement and might have been something more complex. One more thing, Eleanor said. Martha and her son, while we're in Philadelphia. I need to know they'll be cared for. James looked at her. I'll arrange it. Properly, not as an afterthought. Properly, he said. I'll speak to Mrs. Haynes and ensure everything is covered before we leave. Eleanor nodded. All right, she said. Then we have an arrangement. She did not appear particularly thrilled about it. She appeared exactly as she was, a woman who had made a careful decision and was prepared to follow through on it, which James had come to understand was more reliable than thrilled, and more valuable and harder to find. Thomas Monroe shook James's hand afterward, and his grip was firm, in a way that communicated something beyond the formality. Take care of her, Thomas said. Not a request, a fact being stated about what was required. I intend to, James said. No, Thomas Monroe said. I mean, take care of her. She takes care of everything else. She forgets that someone ought to take care of her. James thought about that for a long time. They had been in Philadelphia for 2 days before everything cracked open, in a way neither of them anticipated. The city was everything Virginia was not, compressed and loud and layered with the specific social architecture of people who had been evaluating each other for generations. James felt it the moment they arrived, the slight recalibration of a man returning to his native terrain. He watched Eleanor feel it too, not flinching, but registering, taking accurate measure. She had written a letter before they left. James had seen her writing it, and had not asked whom it was addressed to. He had decided that she had earned the right to move pieces without explaining them in advance, given how the early weeks of their acquaintance had gone. He was extending to her the same latitude he wished he'd been given. The first evening they were received by his Uncle Robert, who was exactly as James had described, a measured man in his 60s, who shook Eleanor's hand and looked at her with the careful attention of someone running a fair assessment. He asked about the Monroe property. He asked about the Eastfield drainage. He asked about Eleanor's management of the estate in practical terms, and Eleanor answered in practical terms, and James watched his uncle's expression shift incrementally from assessment to something warmer. His cousin Frederick predictably followed his father's lead. By the end of the first evening, Frederick had made Eleanor laugh twice, not the almost smile, but an actual laugh, by telling her about a drainage problem on the Whitmore North property that had defeated 3 different contractors. Eleanor said, "The issue is almost certainly upstream." And Frederick had looked at James and said, "I like her," with the uncomplicated directness of a man who hadn't yet learned to be guarded about such things. Mrs. Hargrove arrived on the second morning. James heard the carriage. He heard Mrs. Hargrove's voice in the entrance hall, speaking to the housekeeper about something, and then her footsteps on the floor, quick, purposeful, the stride of a woman who moved through spaces as though she owned them through right of competence rather than title. Eleanor was in the upstairs sitting room. James went up to tell her. She was standing at the writing desk. She had a letter in her hand that she was reading, and when James came in, she looked up with an expression he couldn't immediately read. "She's here," he said. Eleanor nodded. She folded the letter and set it down. She straightened her dress, which didn't need straightening because it was something to do with her hands. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. "Now." "Yes, before we go down." She looked at him. "I wrote to Mrs. Weston in Richmond before we left Virginia." "The woman Margaret corresponds with?" "Yes." I introduced myself and explained the situation plainly, and asked if she would be willing to pass a letter on to Mrs. Hargrove before our arrival. She paused. "Not asking for anything, just introducing myself, in my own words, before someone else introduced me in theirs." James stared at her. "I told you I needed to understand her before I walked into a room with her," Eleanor said, "but I also thought she might benefit from the same opportunity." "You wrote to Margaret Hargrove through an intermediary before the formal introduction," James said very carefully. "Yes. And the letter you just read." "Is from Mrs. Weston," Eleanor said, confirming that she passed it along, and that Mrs. Hargrove read it. She paused, and wrote back. James sat down. "What did she say?" he asked. Eleanor picked up Mrs. Weston's letter again. She found the relevant passage and read it aloud. "Mrs. Hargrove asked me to convey that she found your letter remarkably direct, that she is unaccustomed to being written to plainly by people who expect to be judged by her, and that she intends to form her own opinion when she meets you, which she says is all she's ever done, and all she intends to continue doing." James read that in his mind twice. "That's the closest thing to approval she gives in advance," he said. "I have never in my life heard her say anything that could be interpreted as interest before meeting someone." "She hasn't said she approves?" Eleanor said. "No. She said she intends to form her own opinion." He looked at Eleanor. "For Margaret, that's significant. That's her saying she's coming in without the decision already made." Eleanor set the letter down. "Then, let's go meet her," she said. Margaret Hargrove was 71 years old, and she wore it the way certain women wore age, not despite it, but through it, as though the years had compressed her into something more essential. She was small and straight-backed, and her eyes were the sharpest James had ever seen in a human face that wasn't actively in conflict. She looked at Eleanor for a long moment when they entered the room. Not rude, thorough. Eleanor looked back. "You're shorter than I expected," Mrs. Hargrove said. "You're taller than I expected," Eleanor said. A pause. "Sit," Mrs. Hargrove said. They sat. James, who had seen Margaret Hargrove dismantle 3 separate marriages and 2 business arrangements in this very room over the past decade, positioned himself slightly outside the direct line of the conversation and watched. "You wrote me a letter," Mrs. Hargrove said. "I did," Eleanor said, "through Agnes Weston. I didn't have your address." "You could have asked James." "I could have," Eleanor said. "But a letter arriving through your nephew feels different from a letter arriving through a mutual acquaintance. I wanted you to read it without knowing whose interest it was meant to serve." Mrs. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. It was meant to serve yours. Yes, Eleanor said. But I wanted you to form that conclusion yourself, rather than have it announced in advance. Something shifted in Mrs. Hargrove's expression, not warmed exactly, but recalibrated. The eyes went, if possible, sharper. You managed an estate, Mrs. Hargrove said. I manage an estate, Eleanor said. It's ongoing. Your father is ill. He's improving. The workload has redistributed, but it's still primarily mine. You have debt. We have debt, Eleanor said. We're managing it. The land was undervalued by the interested parties who presented the figures. An independent assessment revised the numbers considerably. James arranged that assessment. I read the assessment and verified it independently, Eleanor said. Then I determined how it changed our position with the relevant parties. Mrs. Hargrove looked at James. He met her eyes and kept his face neutral. She's not what you told me, Mrs. Hargrove said to him. I know, he said. You said she was a practical arrangement. I said that before I went to Virginia, he said. I stopped saying it about a week in. Mrs. Hargrove returned to Eleanor. He went to Virginia under a false name, she said. To evaluate you without your knowledge. Did you know that when you agreed to come here? Yes, Eleanor said. And you came anyway. I came because I determined that who he is now is more relevant than who he was then. She paused. People can change what they understand. If they couldn't, there'd be no point in most of what we do. Mrs. Hargrove sat with that. What do you want? She said. Not from the arrangement. From your life. What do you actually want? It was the most direct question James had ever heard Margaret Hargrove ask. He had never once heard her ask anyone what they wanted. She asked what people could offer, what they could demonstrate, what their credentials were, never what they wanted. Eleanor didn't hesitate. I want to build something, she said. On the Monroe property, a place for families who've lost their land to come and work and learn and get back on their feet. Not charity. Labor and education in exchange for stability. The land can support it if it's managed properly. I've been drawing up plans for 2 years. Mrs. Hargrove stared at her. You have plans. I have detailed plans. I didn't bring them because I didn't think this meeting was the right venue, but they exist. And James would support this. Eleanor glanced at James. I haven't fully told him yet, she said. I'm telling you first because you asked directly, and I decided not to manage the answer. James looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at James briefly with an expression that said, I know. We'll talk. Mrs. Hargrove looked between them. You haven't told your intended about your primary ambition, she said. I've been establishing whether he's someone I can trust with it, Eleanor said. The answer is looking increasingly like yes. But I'm not there yet. The room was very quiet. And then Margaret Hargrove did something James had genuinely never seen her do in the 40 years he'd been watching her operate in rooms like this one. She laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not the social performance of amusement. A genuine laugh, short and real and surprised, like it had gotten out before she'd approved it. Good God, she said. Finally. James stared at his aunt. Finally what? He said. Finally, someone in this family who says the actual thing, Mrs. Hargrove said. She was looking at Eleanor with something that had entirely replaced the careful assessment. Every woman who has been brought to this room in the past 30 years has told me what they thought I wanted to hear. Every one of them. Even your mother. God rest her, and she was a better woman than most. She shook her head slightly. You just told me you don't fully trust my nephew yet to his face in my presence without blinking. It seemed relevant information, Eleanor said. It is, Mrs. Hargrove said. It's the most relevant information you could have given me. She looked at James. She's correct, by the way. You haven't fully earned it. I know, James said. Don't look wounded. It's accurate, and the fact that you know it is in your favor. Mrs. Hargrove turned back to Eleanor. These plans. Send them to me when you return to Virginia. Eleanor blinked, just once. Send them to you. I spent 40 years being the most financially literate person in rooms where no one asked my opinion," Mrs. Hargrove said crisply. "I have strong views on land management and community development, and I have excellent contacts in Richmond who might be useful to you. Agnes Weston is one of them." She paused. "Send me the plans." "I will," Eleanor said. "I'm not approving anything yet," Mrs. Hargrove said. "I didn't ask you to," Eleanor said. Mrs. Hargrove looked at James. "I like her," she said, conditionally. James exhaled for what felt like the first time since they'd come downstairs. But 2 nights later, the thing neither of them had anticipated arrived. James found it on his desk after a dinner that had gone better than expected. Robert and Frederick warmed Mrs. Hargrove in an unprecedented state of engagement, Eleanor managing the whole evening with the same precise attention she brought to drainage problems and fence posts. The letter was from Aldridge. Hand-delivered, marked urgent. James read it standing at his desk. He read it twice. Then he sat down and read it a third time, because the third time didn't change anything, but he needed it to. The letter contained information that Aldridge had received from a contact in the Virginia County Records Office. Information about the Monroe property's title. Information that indicated that a transfer of deed had been filed 3 weeks ago quietly through a secondary recorder in the name of a land holding company, whose principal investor, when traced back through 2 layers of documentation, was Crawford. Crawford had not gone away. Crawford had filed a claim on a portion of the Monroe land based on a disputed boundary survey. The survey had been commissioned and completed while James and Eleanor were traveling. The claim, if not contested within 30 days of filing, would be considered uncontested and would move to summary judgment. 30 days from filing. They had been in Philadelphia for 4 days. They had 26 days. James sat at his desk for a long time. He thought about what Eleanor had said to him the morning he'd written the letters to Richmond without asking. "Next time you want to write letters about my family's land, ask me first. I may want to write them myself." He thought about what she'd said in the formal declaration. "If I feel I'm being managed into something, I'll say so to you first." He had choices about how to handle what was in this letter. He could move on it tonight, contact his people, begin the counter-filing, address it as a logistics problem, the way he'd addressed the culvert. Or he could walk down the hall and knock on Eleanor's door and show her the letter and let her decide what came next. He picked up the letter. He walked down the hall. He knocked. Eleanor's voice came from inside. "One moment." He waited. The door opened. She was in her dressing gown, hair loose with the look of someone who'd been reading by candlelight and had not yet gone to sleep. She looked at his face and then at the letter in his hand, and something shifted in her expression. "Come in," she said. He came in. He gave her the letter without a word. She read it. He watched her face the way he'd watched it the first morning. The internal calculation, the measuring, the quiet management of what she was feeling while she assessed what it meant. When she finished, she looked up. "He filed while we were traveling," she said. "Yes." "He waited until we left Virginia." "Yes." "He knew," she said. "Somehow he knew we'd be away." James had been thinking about that since the third reading of the letter. "Someone told him," he said. "I don't know who. Someone who knew our timeline." Eleanor was very still. 26 days. Yes. She stood up. She went to the small desk in the corner of the room and sat down. She pulled paper toward her. "I need to write to my father tonight," she said. "And to Caleb. Caleb needs to go to the county records office in the morning and get a copy of what Crawford filed. And I need the name of the recorder who processed it, because secondary filings of this kind require a specific commission, and I want to know if that commission was properly paid or if there are grounds to challenge the filing itself on procedural basis." She paused. "Do you have a contact in the Virginia Attorney General's office?" "I have a contact in the Federal Land Office," James said. "Better," she said. "We'll need them to flag the holding company structure. 2 layers of documentation between Crawford and the actual filing is deliberate obfuscation. And if the same structure has been used before with other distressed properties, it may already be known to the federal office. She looked at him. I need you to write that letter tonight. Already planned, he said. She stopped. She looked at him. I came to show you first, he said. I didn't start moving yet. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. A different kind of looking than any she'd directed at him before. Not assessment. Not the careful measuring of a woman deciding what she could trust. Something more than that. You came to me first, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned back to the paper. Then let's work, she said. They sat in Eleanor's room until past midnight, she at the small desk, he at the chair beside it. Papers between them, candles burning down. She wrote to her father and to Caleb with precise, specific instructions. He drafted the letter to the Federal Land Office. They checked each other's language. At one point, she said without looking up from what she was writing, You could have started moving on this before you came to me. You had enough information to begin. Yes, he said, but you didn't. No. She was quiet for a moment. Why? He thought about how to answer. Then he said, Because it's your land, and because you told me who the person who gets to decide things about your land is, and because I believed you. Eleanor put down her pen. She didn't say anything for a moment. James, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name. Not Mr. Whitmore, not said to someone else about him, to him directly with the quiet precision of someone making a deliberate choice about a word. Yes, he said. Thank you, she said. She picked up her pen and went back to writing. He went back to the letter. Outside, Philadelphia went on in its compressed, layered way. Inside, two people sat at a small desk in candlelight and built something together out of shared information and divided labor and the particular kind of trust that can only be made by choosing it deliberately when you also had the option not to. It was not how James had imagined this would go when Aldridge had first laid the envelope on his desk in another city, in another life, that felt further away every day. He was beginning to think that was entirely to his benefit. They left Philadelphia on a Thursday, 4 days after the letter from Aldridge arrived, and the ride back to Virginia was not the same journey as the one that had brought them north. Something had shifted between them in that candlelit room, working until midnight, with papers spread between them and candles burning to stubs. James couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a resolution. It was more like a door that had been standing partially open, finally moving on its hinges, not all the way, but enough that the light coming through was different. Eleanor spent most of the first day of travel writing. She had a leather portfolio on her lap, and she worked through it methodically. Notes, calculations, a list of names and actions in the precise handwriting James had come to associate with her serious thinking. She didn't explain what she was doing, and he didn't ask. He watched the road and thought about Crawford. On the second day, Eleanor said, I need to tell you about the plans. He looked at her. The ones I mentioned to Mrs. Hargrove, she said. The ones I haven't fully told you yet. You said you were establishing whether I could be trusted with them. I was. She folded her hands on top of the portfolio. The Crawford situation clarified it. He waited. She told him about the plans, and as she talked, he understood why she'd held them back. It wasn't a small idea dressed up in careful language. It was detailed and researched, and specific, a structured program for families who had lost their land to debt or fraud or circumstance offering housing and work, and basic education in exchange for labor on the Monroe property, with a graduation structure that would eventually allow families to accumulate enough to lease or purchase small parcels of land of their own. She had cost projections. She had a timeline. She had a model based on something she'd read about a similar effort in Pennsylvania that had operated quietly for 12 years with consistent results. She had been building this in her head and apparently on paper for 2 years. While managing an estate. While her father was ill. While Crawford circled. While Harrington sent his letter through a solicitor, and the women on the road said she was performing and the world arranged itself to make her smaller. James listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "How much would it cost to begin the first phase?" Eleanor looked at him. "You're asking about cost. I want to know the number." She told him the number. He nodded. "That's manageable," he said. "James, not as a gift," he said. "I've thought about how to say this, and I want to say it correctly. The Monroe property is your family's. What you build on it is yours. But I have resources that can fund the first phase without affecting the estate's operating capital, and I would like to provide them as an investment in the outcome rather than a transaction with strings." He paused. "In writing, whatever terms you think are appropriate." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "You read the plans?" she said. "You've never seen the plans." "I've seen how you think," he said. "The plans are the same kind of thinking. I don't need to read them to know they're sound." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully decode, something between moved and resistant to being moved, the specific tension of a person who has learned not to accept things too quickly because acceptance has cost them before. "I'll show you the plans first," she said finally. "Then we discuss terms." "Fair," he said. She looked back out at the road. Then quietly, almost to herself, "My mother would have liked you. Eventually. After she'd decided you'd earned it." He didn't say anything. He understood the weight of that offering, what it cost to give it, what it meant to receive it. They rode on toward Virginia, and the distance between them was smaller than it had been before, and the shape of what they were building together was becoming clearer to him with every mile. They arrived at Clover Hill in the early evening to find Caleb on the front porch with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a long time and has news that cannot wait any longer. "Crawford's man was here yesterday," Caleb said before they'd fully dismounted. "Not Crawford, one of his men. He came to speak to your father." Eleanor was off the horse before he finished the sentence. "Where's Papa?" "Inside. He's fine. He wouldn't let the man, and Mrs. Haynes backed him up on it, and I was here. But he left a document." Caleb produced a folded paper from his pocket. "I wouldn't let your father read it alone." Eleanor took the document. She read it on the porch standing, and James watched her face and saw something he hadn't seen before. Not the managed stillness, not the careful containment. Something that moved through her like a current, fast and sharp, before she controlled it. She handed him the document. It was a formal notice from Crawford's legal representative citing the boundary survey claim, advising that any improvements to the disputed section of the Monroe property should cease pending resolution, and noting that failure to respond to the underlying claim within the remaining window would result in summary proceedings. It was also, James noted, addressed not to Eleanor but to Thomas Monroe, specifically exclusively to Thomas Monroe. Crawford had gone around Eleanor deliberately. He had gone to the father, to the man whose name was on the deed, to the man who was ill and sometimes forgot what he'd agreed to, and who had 2 years ago, before Eleanor had fully taken over, been vulnerable to exactly this kind of pressure. Eleanor understood that at the same moment James did. He watched her understand it. "Where is he?" she said. Her voice was even. "Study," Caleb said. She went inside. James followed. Thomas Monroe was at his desk with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and he looked up when Eleanor came in with the expression of a man who has spent the past 24 hours deciding how to present a situation to his daughter, and has not arrived at a satisfactory answer. "I didn't sign anything," he said immediately. "I know, Papa." She pulled a chair close to his desk and sat down. "Tell me exactly what Crawford's man said," Thomas Monroe told them. It was worse than James had hoped. Crawford's representative had been precise and deliberate. He'd emphasized Thomas Monroe's name on the deed, mentioned that the legal process could become complicated and expensive for the family, suggested that a negotiated resolution would serve everyone's interests better than a protracted legal dispute. He had used the word stressful 3 times. He had looked at Thomas Monroe's cane and his thinning frame and his careful movements, and made sure Thomas understood that the process would fall primarily on him. Because Crawford knew Eleanor would be back. He just wanted Thomas Monroe frightened enough before she arrived that the conversation would already be contaminated. "He's trying to split you," James said. Not to Eleanor, to Thomas Monroe directly. "He wants you uncertain enough that Eleanor comes back to a situation that's already partly decided." Thomas Monroe looked at him. Then he looked at his daughter. "That was my read as well," he said. "Took me until this morning to be sure, but that was my read." Eleanor put her hand over her father's on the desk. It was a brief touch. She wasn't a demonstrative person, but it was deliberate, and Thomas Monroe's expression changed when she did it. "We have 22 days, she said, "and we came back with more than Crawford expected us to have." "What do we have?" Thomas asked. Eleanor looked at James. "A contact in the Federal Land Office," James said. "A network in Richmond that's been building a file on Crawford's methods for 2 years, a land assessment that corrects his valuation by a significant margin, and the procedural documentation on the boundary survey which Caleb is going to obtain tomorrow morning." Caleb from the doorway said, "Already planned." Thomas Monroe looked between all three of them. "When did this happen?" he said. Not unhappily. More like a man counting things he hadn't known to count. "The past few weeks," Eleanor said. He picked up his cold tea and looked at it and set it down. "Mrs. Haynes will have supper ready. We'll eat, and then you'll tell me everything." The boundary survey was the key, and they found the crack in it on the 3rd day after returning. Caleb had gotten the filed document from the county records office, and James's solicitor in Philadelphia had connected him overnight by letter with a land law specialist in Richmond named Mr. Denton, who had strong opinions about improper survey methodology and was not shy about expressing them. Denton's assessment arrived by fast courier on the 5th day. James read it in the kitchen with Eleanor standing at his shoulder, and then Eleanor read it herself, and then she said quietly and with considerable precision, "He used a reference marker that was moved." "Yes," James said. "The original survey map from 1804 shows the marker in a different position," she said. "The 1804 survey is on file in the county archives." "Yes, and the man who commissioned the new survey is Crawford's own assessor, who has worked exclusively for Crawford on 3 previous boundary disputes in 2 other counties," James said, 2 of which were resolved in Crawford's favor before anyone looked carefully at the methodology. Eleanor set the letter down. She was very still. "He's done this before," she said. "Yes." "2 other families." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. James watched her. He'd learned to read her pauses, the ones where she was managing something emotional, the ones where she was calculating, and the ones where she was doing both at the same time. This was the 3rd kind. "We need to go to Richmond," she said. "Not a letter, in person, with the 1804 map and Denton's assessment and the documentation from your federal contact and the file on the other 2 families." "Yes," he said, "and we need someone with legal standing to present it." "Denton will come," James said. "I already asked. He said, and I am telling you his exact words, that he would travel to Richmond for this case for free, because he finds Crawford's methods personally offensive." Eleanor looked at him. "You already asked." "Last night, after we read the courier's letter." "You didn't tell me you were writing to him." He met her eyes. "I was going to tell you in the morning," he said. "I did not act on the response. I waited for you to read it and decide." A beat. "All right," she said. "I'm trying," he said. "I'm not always going to do it perfectly, but I'm trying." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "I see that you are." She picked up Denton's letter again. "Write back and tell him we'll need him in Richmond within 10 days. The Richmond hearing was not a dramatic event in the way that James had imagined courthouse proceedings might be from the outside. It was not loud. There were no crowds. It was a room with a land records official named Mr. Hensley, who had skeptical eyes and a reputation, Denton told them, for not being impressed by people with money who expected their money to do their thinking for them. Crawford was there. He arrived with 2 legal representatives and the confident bearing of a man who has won this particular game before. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at James. He looked at Denton. Something changed in his face. A very small shift, barely visible, like a man who has just recalculated the odds without wanting it to show. James noticed it. Eleanor noticed it. Denton, who had seen it before on other faces in other rooms, simply opened his documents and said nothing. The proceeding lasted 3 hours. Denton presented the 1804 survey map. He presented the photographic comparison of the reference marker position. He presented his methodology assessment in language so precise and so systematic that Mr. Hensley stopped looking skeptical and started looking like a man taking notes. He presented the documentation from James's federal contact, 2 previous cases, same assessor, same methodology outcomes that had consistently benefited Crawford at the expense of smaller landowners. Crawford's representatives objected 3 times. Hensley overruled twice and allowed 1. Denton responded to the allowed objection with an addendum to his assessment that Eleanor had helped him draft the night before. At one point, Hensley looked directly at Crawford and said, "Are you aware that the assessor who conducted the survey in question was involved in a similar dispute in Fredericksburg in 1814 that was subsequently reviewed and reversed?" Crawford's lead representative said, "We were not made aware." "I wasn't asking your representative," Hensley said. He looked at Crawford. "Were you aware?" Crawford said nothing. Hensley made a note. At the end of the 3rd hour, Hensley said he would issue a ruling within 5 business days. He said it in the tone of a man who has already decided but is going to do the paperwork properly. Outside on the steps, Crawford's representatives moved quickly toward their carriage. Crawford himself paused. He looked at Eleanor. "You understand this isn't the end of the land market pressures in your area," Crawford said. Not threatening, almost conversational. The tone of a man who has decided this particular engagement is over and is trying to retain some dignity in the retreat. "I understand the land market quite well," Eleanor said. "I've been managing it for 2 years. Crawford looked at James. "I had you placed as a practical man," Crawford said. "I am practical," James said. "This is what practical looks like when it's pointed in the right direction." Crawford got in his carriage. Denton beside James said quietly, "I've been waiting 3 years to see that man leave a Richmond proceeding first." But Hensley issued his ruling in 4 days, not 5. The boundary claim was dismissed. The survey was flagged as methodologically compromised. Crawford's assessor's work was referred for review. The flag, Denton explained, would follow any future filings that used the same assessor in the same district. Caleb read the rulings aloud at the supper table at Clover Hill that evening because Eleanor had handed it to him with the specific intention that he be the one to do it. James watched Caleb's voice get steadier as he got further into the document and understood what it meant, and watched the table. Thomas Monroe, Mrs. Haynes Eli, and George and Martha and her son, with his 4 rolls, listened with the quality of attention of people who understood that what had been at stake was the place where they lived and the life they'd built around it. When Caleb finished, Thomas Monroe said, "Well." "Well," Eleanor agreed. "Crawford won't come back," Thomas Monroe said. "Not directly," Eleanor said. "But there are others like him. That's why the plans matter. A property that's actively productive and has documented community investment is harder to target than one that's just land." "The plans," Thomas Monroe said, looking at James. "Eleanor told me about them on the road back from Philadelphia," James said. "I'd like to see them when she's ready to show them." Eleanor across the table looked at him with the particular quality he'd come to wait for, the thing adjacent to warmth that had been appearing more often closer to the surface since the night they'd worked by candlelight in Philadelphia. "Saturday," she said. "I'll show you Saturday." "Saturday," he said. On Saturday morning, she spread the plans across the big table in the Monroe study. James looked at them for a long time. They were exactly what she'd described, detailed and specific, and built on 2 years of careful thinking. But seeing them on paper was different. There were maps, annotated. Property sections marked for different phases. cost projections in her precise handwriting. A reading curriculum drafted in the margins of one page that she'd apparently developed herself. A list of families already identified as potential first participants with notes beside each name. Beside the Calloway family, she'd written Daniel's leg healed by spring. Could manage the north field work by summer. He stood there and looked at the plans and understood something he hadn't fully understood until that moment. Not what she was capable of, which he'd known for weeks, but the specific nature of her ambition. She didn't want to be powerful. She wanted to build something that outlasted her, something that would stand on that land and matter to people who needed it to matter. "You've been working on this for 2 years, he said. "Since the second winter after Mama died," she said. "When the Harmon family lost their property. I watched them leave and I thought there has to be something different. There has to be a way to change the direction of what happens to people in these situations." She paused. "It took me about 6 months to decide the way was land, productive land. Not charity, because charity ends when the charitable person runs out of goodwill or money. Structure, something self-sustaining." "It's good," James said. "It's better than good. There are 2 things in the cost projection I think you're underestimating. May I?" She handed him a pen. He made 2 notes in the margin with figures. She read them. She made a 3rd note that revised one of his. He read her revision and nodded. "Fair," he said. She looked at the plans. "Phase 1, she said. "The Calloway family and 2 others. Start small. Demonstrate the model works, then expand." "I'll write to my solicitor next week," James said. "The investment structure we discussed on the road." "The terms we haven't finished discussing," Eleanor said. "Yes." He set the pen down. "What terms do you want?" "No authority over the program," she said. "Not for you, not for anyone Whitmore connected. The money funds the infrastructure. The decisions stay with the Monroe family." "Agreed." "The investment documents cannot be used as leverage against the property in any circumstance." "Agreed. I'll have that language specifically included." "And a documented sunset," she said. "The investment converts to a grant after 10 years with no repayment obligation. If the program succeeds, the Monroe property should hold the outcome free and clear." James looked at her. "You've thought about the terms for a while." "I thought about them the second day on the road back," she said. "After you mentioned the investment." "Those terms are acceptable," he said. "All of them." Eleanor looked at the plans. Then she looked at him. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "Mrs. Hargrove wrote to me," she said. 3 days ago. "I know. I saw the letter arrive." "She wants to correspond about the program," Eleanor said. "She has a contact who worked on the Pennsylvania model. She said—" Eleanor paused. "She said she has spent 40 years watching people build things she was not allowed to be part of. She would like if I'm willing to be part of this one." James was quiet for a moment. "What did you write back?" he said. "I told her yes," Eleanor said. "And I told her the first thing I needed from her was an introduction to the Pennsylvania contact." "She'll love that," James said. "She'll pretend to find it presumptuous, and she'll love every moment of it." Something passed across Eleanor's face, warm and unguarded there, and gone quickly. "I think she's a remarkable woman who was dealt a difficult hand and played it as well as anyone could," she said. "I told her that too." "You told Margaret Hargrove she had a difficult hand." "I told her plainly," Eleanor said. "She seemed to prefer plain." She looked at the plans. "She said one more thing at the end of the letter." "What?" Eleanor looked at him with an expression that he was only now, after weeks of careful observation, beginning to fully understand. It was not the assessment quality. It was not the managed stillness. It was something older and more open and considerably more vulnerable, and she was choosing to let him see it. She said, Eleanor said, "For what it's worth, I believe my nephew has found something he did not know he was looking for, and I hope you will not make him wait too long to know whether you feel the same." The room was very quiet. James looked at Eleanor Monroe, at the plans spread between them, at the pen she was still holding, at the 2 years of careful work laid out on her mother's table in her father's study, and he said, "Mrs. Hargrove is not wrong." Eleanor set the pen down. "I know," she said. "She's right about most things when you let her be." "Eleanor." She looked at him. "I came to Virginia to find out whether you were worth trusting," he said. "I found out the answer within the first week, and spent the rest of the time finding out whether I was worth trusting myself." He paused. "I'm not done with that. I think it takes longer than a summer, but I am asking you not as part of the arrangement, not because of my father's will or the Whitmore estate or any of it. I am asking you if you want to build this together." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear the yard. Eli and George's perennial argument. Mrs. Haynes calling something to Caleb, the particular sounds of a place that was alive and cared for and hers. "I want to be very clear," Eleanor said, "about what you're asking. Build the program," he said. "Build this place into what your plans say it can be. And be married to me while we do it, because I want to be there for it, not because I need to satisfy a legal condition, but because I cannot think of anywhere I would more honestly rather be." Eleanor looked at the plans. Then she looked at him. "You'll stay in Virginia," she said, "as much as possible. The Philadelphia properties can be managed remotely for most of what they need." "Yes, you'll work with me on this," she said. "Not for me. With me." "Yes," he said. "That is the only version I'm proposing." Eleanor Monroe picked up the pen she'd set down. She looked at the plans. She looked at James. "All right," she said. It was not, James thought, the most romantic acceptance he might have imagined in his younger years. There were no grand gestures. Nobody was weeping. Eleanor's expression was careful and warm, and certain, which he had learned was the most valuable combination of things she had to offer, and which very few people had been patient enough to see. "All right," he said. She made a note on the plans. "Phase 1 starts in spring," she said. "We'll need to begin preparing the north housing section before the cold sets in." "I'll look at it next week," he said. "With me," she said. "With you," he said. She almost smiled. Then she did smile properly, fully, the kind he hadn't seen her give easily. It was brief and real, and lit something in her face that he intended to spend a considerable amount of time making happen again. "The Calloway family," she said. "I want them to be first." "Then they'll be first," he said. She nodded and went back to the plans, and he stood beside her at the table. And they worked, and through the window, the Virginia summer went on unhurried and warm, full of everything that was about to begin. The wedding was a Thursday. Eleanor had chosen Thursday because it was, as she explained to Mrs. Haynes with complete seriousness, the least ceremonially weighted day of the week, and she did not want the occasion to become something that required managing in the way that Saturdays inevitably did when there were expectations attached. Mrs. Haynes had looked at her for a long moment and then said that was the most Eleanor Monroe reason for choosing a wedding day she had ever heard, and Eleanor had taken that as confirmation she'd made the right call. It was small. Thomas Monroe walked his daughter to the parlor where the minister waited, and his grip on her arm was firm, in the way it had been when he'd shaken James's hand months ago. The grip of a man who was communicating something that mattered to him too much for words to carry it alone. Caleb stood near the window with his arms crossed and his jaw set, in the particular way of a 16-year-old boy determined not to show that he was moved. Mrs. Haynes cried openly and appeared to feel no contradiction about it. Martha sat with her son in her lap, and the boy, who had been told this was an important occasion, sat very still for approximately 4 minutes before quietly asking his mother if there would be cake. There was cake. Mrs. Haynes had seen to it. James stood in the Monroe parlor and watched Eleanor come through the door, and thought not for the first time, and not for the last, that he had arrived in Virginia. Certain he already knew what he would find, and had instead found something so thoroughly different from his assumptions that the man who had written her off as a practical arrangement felt like a person he'd only heard about secondhand. She was wearing a dress he hadn't seen before. Blue, simple, nothing extravagant, and she walked into the room with the same quality she brought to everything deliberate, grounded, present. She was not performing. She was not trying to be something. She was exactly who she was in the parlor of her own house, choosing something with the same careful certainty she brought to drainage problems and fence posts and land claims. She looked at James. He looked at her. Something in the look they exchanged was private in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else in the room. The minister spoke. They answered. When it was done, Eleanor stood beside James with the quiet expression of someone who has completed a significant undertaking and is already thinking about the next one. Thomas Monroe shook James's hand again, and then unexpectedly pulled him briefly forward into the particular embrace of a man who has decided someone has earned something. Caleb shook James's hand with a grip that was somewhat harder than was technically necessary. James respected it. At supper, which was the ordinary Clover Hill supper, with extra food, and the addition of the minister and his wife Thomas Monroe, made a toast that was 2 sentences long. To my daughter, who has always known exactly who she was, and to the man patient enough to learn it. James raised his glass. Eleanor said quietly beside him, "He practiced that." "I know," James said. "It was good." "Don't tell him that," she said. "He'll write a longer one for the next occasion." James laughed. He hadn't laughed easily in years before Virginia. He noticed it every time still, like something he was keeping count of. The Calloway family moved into the North Housing section on the 1st of October. Eleanor had spent 3 weeks preparing it, working alongside Eli and George and 2 men from the Calloway family, who had started working on the property before the official move as a way of beginning the labor arrangement. That was the program's structural foundation. Daniel Calloway's leg had healed through the summer slowly with 2 setbacks and 1 frightening week in August, when it seemed it might not heal correctly. And by the time October came, he walked with a slight favoring of it that he said didn't bother him, and that his wife Sarah said she'd be watching. Sarah Calloway was a woman of approximately 40 who had the kind of competence that comes from having handled emergencies long enough that emergencies no longer frightened her, only annoyed her. Eleanor had liked her immediately. The feeling appeared to be mutual, established within the first 20 minutes of their acquaintance over a frank conversation about the North Housing section's roof, which Sarah had assessed with a sharp eye, and declared sound on the right side and needing attention on the left. "She's right," Eleanor told James that evening. "Left side needs attention before winter." "I know," James said. "I noticed it last week." "Why didn't you say something?" "I was going to. Then I thought Sarah Calloway would notice and tell you herself, and you'd find it more useful to hear it from her." Eleanor looked at him. "That's very strategic." "I'm a practical man," he said. "You knew that before you married me." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The left side of the roof needs attention. I'll have Eli look at it tomorrow. With George. They won't finish the argument they've been having since August otherwise." He agreed. She picked up the plans from the table. She made a note. He watched her make it and thought about what Thomas Monroe had said at the porch. She takes care of everything else. She forgets that someone ought to take care of her. And he thought about whether he was doing that well enough, and whether she would tell him if he wasn't. She would. He knew she would. That was one of the most reliable things about her, and it was also, he had decided, one of the things he was most grateful for, because it meant he didn't have to guess, and he was not, as it turned out, particularly good at guessing with people he cared about. "Eleanor," he said. She looked up. "Are you all right?" he said. "Not the program, not the roof, you." She held his gaze for a moment. It was a question she was still learning to receive. He could see her receiving it, the slight adjustment, the decision to actually answer, rather than deflect into logistics. "I'm tired," she said. "Good tired mostly. The kind that means things are happening." She paused. "I'm also aware that we have 3 more families identified for the spring phase, and I don't know yet how the winter is going to affect the North Field, and I'm trying not to think about both things at once." "You are thinking about both things at once." "I'm always thinking about everything at once," she said. "I've made my peace with that." He crossed to the table. He sat across from her. "The North Field will hold through winter if we address the drainage rework before the first frost," he said. "We have enough time to do that and enough hands. The 3 spring families," which 3, she told him. He knew 2 of the names, The third was new. The Harding family, she said. They lost their property in the spring. Amos Harding worked the east side of the county for 15 years. He knows tobacco cultivation, and he knows it well. That's a skill the program needs. How did you find them? Sarah Calloway told me, Eleanor said. She knew them from church. She said they were proud and that I should approach it carefully. She paused. I wrote to Amos Harding myself. I told him exactly what the program was and exactly what it required. I told him there was no diminishment in accepting structured support when the structure was sound. What did he write back? He asked 3 questions about the land and 2 about the education component for his children, she said. Then he said he'd come see it himself before deciding. When? Next week. James nodded. Let me know when he arrives. I'll make myself scarce. Eleanor looked at him. Why? Because he's a proud man who's been through a hard year, and your meeting will go better if it's just you, James said. I have a particular presence that occasionally complicates negotiations. Eleanor considered this. The Duke of Whitmore effect, she said. Something like that. You're right, she said. Stay in the East Field. Happily. She made another note on the plans. He watched her make it, and felt with the particular clarity of a man who had spent a long time not letting himself feel things that were this specific that he was very exactly where he wanted to be. Denton wrote, he said. She looked up. Crawford's assessor had his credentials reviewed, James said. 3 prior surveys are being re-examined. There are 2 other families who filed boundary challenges in the past year. Denton thinks both have strong grounds for reversal if someone can support the legal costs. Eleanor was very still. Which families? A family named Porter in the next county, and a family named Wells further south. He paused. Denton wants to know if we'd like to be involved in supporting the challenges. Eleanor set the plans down. Involved how? Legal cost coverage. Evidentiary support. We have the methodology documentation from the Richmond hearing. Denton does the actual work. Crawford targeted them the same way he targeted us, she said. Same assessor, same methodology, same holding company structure. She was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said. Yes to involvement. Yes to involvement, she said. All of it. Write to Denton tomorrow. She paused. But I want to write to the Porter and Wells families myself, before the legal proceedings start, the same way I approached Amos Harding. She met his eyes. They should hear it from a person first, not a solicitor. That's the right approach, James said. I know, she said. It was not arrogance. It was just Eleanor who understood how people received things and always addressed that first. Margaret Hargrove arrived in Virginia in November, which nobody had anticipated. Her letter had said she was considering a visit in the spring possibly. The carriage that appeared at Clover Hill on a Tuesday morning in the second week of November had not been preceded by any letter at all. Mrs. Haynes came to find Eleanor in the North Field, where she and Sarah Calloway were reviewing the roof repair, and said with the particular expression of someone delivering news of uncertain classification, "There is a very small, very straight woman in the parlor who says she is Mrs. Hargrove, and who has brought enough luggage for a month." Eleanor looked at Mrs. Haynes. "She also told me my biscuits looked adequate," Mrs. Haynes added, which I believe was meant as a compliment. Eleanor came inside. Margaret Hargrove was in the parlor with her traveling coat still on, examining the plans on the study table that Eleanor had left there that morning. She turned when Eleanor came in. "You left your plans out," Mrs. Hargrove said. "I wasn't expecting company," Eleanor said. "Evidently." Mrs. Hargrove looked at the plans. Phase 1 is running. The Calloways moved in October, 3 more families in spring. The education component. Mrs. Hargrove indicated a section of the plans. You've drafted a reading curriculum. The basis of one, it needs refinement. I've been corresponding with a woman in Boston who spent 12 years developing adult literacy programs for working families, Mrs. Hargrove said. I took the liberty of sharing your curriculum outline with her. I hope you don't mind. Eleanor looked at her. Did she respond? She sent 14 pages of notes, Mrs. Hargrove said. They're in the second trunk. I thought you could review them together. She paused. I also thought I should see the property before I made any further introductions on your behalf. I prefer to know what I'm recommending. So this is an inspection, Eleanor said. This is a visit, Mrs. Hargrove said, between women who are building something. I find inspections condescending. Visits are collaborative. She looked at Eleanor with the sharp eyes that James had once described to Eleanor as the sharpest he'd ever seen in a human face. I am aware that I arrived without notice. If the timing is genuinely inconvenient, I can arrange lodging in town. You'll stay here, Eleanor said. I hoped you'd say that. A pause. Your biscuits are better than your housekeeper's. Mrs. Haynes has strong feelings about her biscuits, Eleanor said. Then she should feel them more strongly when she's making them, Mrs. Hargrove said. The recipe is sound. The execution is tentative. Eleanor, against her own intention, smiled. Mrs. Hargrove saw it. Something softened in her expression briefly, precisely, in the manner of a woman who had kept a tight hold on what she let show for a very long time, but was in this particular company allowing a measured relaxation of that discipline. The Portland family in Boston, Mrs. Hargrove said. The woman I mentioned, her name is Helen Portland. She would like to correspond with you directly. She's been looking for a model to extend to Virginia for 3 years. She thinks what you're building here could be the right structure for it. A pause. I told her you were the most practical person I'd met in 40 years, and that if she said anything that wasn't immediately useful, you would tell her so without softening it. Is that what you told her? Eleanor said. I also told her you were honest to a degree that initially alarmed me, and that I now find refreshing beyond my ability to properly express. Mrs. Hargrove picked up her gloves from the chair. Where is my nephew? Eastfield, Eleanor said. He'll be back for supper. Good. I have something to say to him. She paused. Nothing alarming. The opposite. Eleanor nodded. Show me the north housing section, Mrs. Hargrove said. The one the Calloway family is using. I want to see how it's been adapted. Sarah Calloway will be there, Eleanor said. She has opinions. Excellent, Mrs. Hargrove said. So do I. We'll compare them. What Mrs. Hargrove said to James at supper was this: You were a proud, closed, suspicious man when your father died. I said so at the time. I am saying now in front of your wife that I was right then, and I am glad to be wrong about what you've become. James looked at his aunt across the Clover Hill supper table. Margaret, he said. I'm not finished, she said. I spent 40 years watching the Whitmore men choose badly or choose well for the wrong reasons. You chose well eventually for reasons I find I actually respect. I am documenting that, so you can't misremember it later. Thomas Monroe, at the end of the table, said, I like her to no one in particular. I know, Caleb said. Mrs. Hargrove looked at Caleb. You're the boy who ran the gate when James arrived. Caleb looked slightly alarmed. Yes, ma'am. You assessed him accurately and communicated your skepticism through non-verbal means when he turned out to be a duke, she said. I've heard the story. That was sensible behavior. Caleb said nothing, which was the correct response. Mrs. Haynes's biscuits came out better at supper than they had at breakfast. Eleanor caught Mrs. Haynes's eye across the kitchen, and Mrs. Haynes made a brief expression that communicated that she had heard Mrs. Hargrove's assessment and had some thoughts about it, and had chosen to respond by simply making better biscuits, which Eleanor found completely characteristic and completely right. The letter from Helen Portland arrived in December, and it was, as Margaret Hargrove had suggested, immediately useful. Helen Portland had been running adult literacy and land skills programs in Massachusetts for 12 years, with the specific goal of addressing exactly the situation Eleanor was building toward, and her letter was 30 pages of practical information written in the direct language of a woman who had made every possible mistake already and saw no point in allowing someone else to repeat them. Eleanor read the letter twice in one sitting. Then she wrote back the same evening. Their correspondence over the following months would eventually fill 2 ledger books and result in 3 visits, a published document on program methodology that circulated in 4 states, and a friendship that Eleanor years later would describe as one of the most useful relationships of her professional life, which Helen Portland would describe in her own memoir as one of the best compliments she'd ever received. But that was later. In December 1817, Eleanor Monroe Whitmore sat at the study table with Helen Portland's letter and wrote back 10 pages and felt for the first time the specific sensation of a project she'd been building alone, gaining the weight and momentum of something that was going to outlast her. James came in at midnight to find her still writing. "Come to bed," he said. "15 more minutes," she said. He sat down. He looked at the letter and the pages she'd written in response. He read a paragraph over her shoulder. "She's good," he said. "She's extraordinary," Eleanor said. "She made every mistake I'm going to make and documented all of them. It's the most useful document I've ever read." "Then write her a good letter," he said, "and then come to bed." She wrote 3 more pages. Then she set down the pen. "James," she said. "Yes." "The Porter family," she said. "Denton says the challenge is going well. They might have a ruling by February." "He told me the same thing." "And the Wells family?" "March, he thinks. Maybe April." She was quiet for a moment. "When they win," she said, "I want to write to them myself." "I know you do," he said. "Not about the program," she said, "just to say it's over. That it worked, that they can go home." She paused. "Someone should say that to them, that they can go home." James looked at her. He thought about the women on the road who'd said she was performing. He thought about Harrington's letter and the particular thing it had clarified in her that she'd told him about on the porch that morning with the coffee cups. He thought about Crawford riding away from Clover Hill the first time, and Eleanor watching from the doorway with hands that were absolutely still, which he now knew was more serious than shaking. "You'll write them," he said, "and it'll be the right letter." She nodded. She stood up. She organized the papers on the table with the neat efficiency of someone who would be back at it early tomorrow morning. At the door, she stopped. "James," she said. "Yes." "Thank you for sitting with me." "I wasn't doing anything," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I mean." The spring came early in 1818. The Harding family arrived in March. Amos Harding with his wife and 4 children. The youngest carried on his hip with the specific combination of pride and exhaustion of a man who has been through something hard and come out the other side still himself. He walked the north section with Eleanor and asked 2 practical questions, and 1 question that wasn't practical at all, which was, "Why are you doing this?" Eleanor said, "Because someone should have done it sooner." Amos Harding was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's a good enough answer." And they went back to the practical questions. By April, there were 3 families in the north section. By May, there were 4. Daniel Calloway's leg had settled into something close to full strength, and he'd taken on oversight of the east field work, which he managed with a quiet competence that made Eli and George defer to him within the first 2 weeks, which was not something Eli and George did easily. Sarah Calloway began teaching the reading curriculum in the 2nd month of spring, working from Helen Portland's refined version that Eleanor had adapted for Virginia conditions. The first session had 6 adults and 11 children. The second had 12 adults and 15 children. By the 3rd week, 2 of the adults who had learned to read were teaching the children themselves, which was not a planned development, but which Eleanor noted in the program documentation as an outcome to be intentionally designed for in the future. Margaret Hargrove had gone back to Philadelphia in January with 4 pages of notes and a list of people she intended to write to on the program's behalf. Her correspondence campaign turned out to be formidable. By spring, 3 letters had arrived at Clover Hill from individuals in Philadelphia and Boston, and 1 in Richmond, who had heard about the Monroe program and wanted to know more. Denton fielded the Richmond inquiry. James fielded the Philadelphia one. Eleanor handled Boston herself. The Wells family won their boundary challenge in April. Eleanor wrote the letter the same day Denton's notice arrived. She wrote it at the kitchen table because the study was full of Helen Portland's latest correspondence and Amos Harding's crop rotation notes, and a letter from a man in Fredericksburg who had heard from Denton's contact that the Monroe property had a program that might suit his family's situation. She wrote, "I am writing to tell you that the ruling has come and it is in your favor and the land is yours. I wanted you to hear it from a person first, not a document. Go home. It has been waiting for you." She did not sign it with the Whitmore name. She signed it with her own. Eleanor Monroe, Clover Hill, Virginia. She showed it to James before she sent it. He read it. He handed it back. "Send it," he said. She sent it. Ryu. Thomas Monroe had a good summer. He was not well. The baseline had shifted after the winters of Eleanor's management, and they all understood this in the particular way of a family that has stopped pretending. But he was present, and he was clear-headed, and he spent mornings at his desk with Helen Portland's letters that Eleanor brought him to read because she said the documentation was useful and because she understood without saying so that he needed to see what had grown from the ground he'd stood on. One morning in July, he called James into the study. James came in. Thomas Monroe was at his desk with his tea looking at the plans Eleanor had pinned to the wall when the table was no longer large enough to hold them flat. "Sit," Thomas Monroe said. James sat. "When you came here," Thomas Monroe said, "you came to find out if my daughter was worth something." "Yes," James said, "and you found out she was." "I found out I'd been asking the wrong question," James said. "She was never the one who needed to be examined." Thomas Monroe nodded slowly. "She's always known what she was worth," he said. "The problem was that the world kept telling her different, and she kept having to decide every day whether to believe the world or believe herself." He paused. "Some days it was harder than others." "I know," James said. "Do you—" Thomas Monroe looked at him, not unkindly, with the precision of a man who had watched his daughter for 24 years. "I wonder sometimes if you see the full cost, not the result. The cost." James was quiet. "She doesn't show it," Thomas Monroe said. "She never did. Her mother was the same. But there was a year after Harrington, after her mother died, when she came in from the fields every evening, and I'd hear her in the kitchen past midnight, and I knew she wasn't cooking." He set down his tea. "She was working on the plans. That's what she does when it's hard. She builds something." James said nothing. He let that land where it needed to land. "I am telling you this," Thomas Monroe said, "not because you've done anything wrong. You've done nearly everything right, which I will note is remarkable given how you started." He smiled slightly. "I'm telling you because the plans are big now. The program is growing. People are coming from 3 counties to learn about it. And Eleanor is going to keep expanding it and working it and building it, and she is going to need someone who sees the cost and not just the result." He looked at James. "That's the only thing I'm asking of you. See the full cost." "I'll try," James said. "I know," Thomas Monroe said. "You're the kind of man who tries the right things once someone points at them." He picked up his tea. "Go find your wife. She's been in the north section since before sunrise." James went. He found her with Sarah Calloway and 2 of the Harding children standing near the section of fence that had been Eleanor's first site of operations on the day James had arrived. She was explaining something to the children. Her hands moving her face animated the focused quality she brought to everything, taking on a warmth in this context that James had watched develop across the months of the program. The gradual loosening of a woman who had managed alone for so long that collaboration had had to be relearned. She saw him coming. She finished what she was saying to the children. She said something to Sarah Calloway, who nodded and took the children back toward the housing section. Eleanor walked toward James. "My father sent you," she said. "He asked me to find you. He worries. He said you've been here since before sunrise. The Harding children are learning the property boundaries," she said. "It matters that they know them. This is their place as much as anyone's." James looked at her. "Eleanor," he said, "I know what you're going to say." "Eat breakfast," he said. She stopped. "That's what you were going to say?" You've been out here for 4 hours, and you didn't eat before you came out because Mrs. Haynes said so." She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted the thing that was by now very familiar to him, the warmth that came to the surface when she was caught being taken care of and didn't quite know how to receive it gracefully. "Mrs. Haynes tells you things," she said. "Constantly," he said. "She considers it a public service." Eleanor exhaled. Then she said, "I'll eat." "Good." She turned toward the house. He walked beside her. The north section was alive around them. Voices, children, the sound of work being done by people who were doing it for themselves. The particular quality of a place that had become something because someone had refused to accept that it couldn't. "James," Eleanor said. "Yes." "The letter came this morning. The one from Massachusetts. The Portland Institute letter. They want to formalize the partnership," she said. "An official documentation of the model. Something replicable." He heard what was under that. "That means putting your name on it." "Our name," she said. "The program's name." "That's not the same as your name," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." She looked at the house coming into view. "There will be people who object, who say a woman shouldn't be the named architect of this." "Yes," he said. "There will be." "You're not going to tell me it doesn't matter?" "No," he said. "It matters. It's real. And you're going to do it anyway." She looked at him. "You're certain of that?" "You've been doing it anyway since before I arrived," he said. "I'm not sure you know how to stop." Eleanor Monroe. Whitmore looked at her husband in the Virginia summer morning, with a year of everything they'd built between them, and said with the quiet certainty that was the most characteristic thing about her. "No," she said. "I really don't." She went inside. He followed. He bashaw. Mrs. Haynes had biscuits ready, and said nothing about the hour with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had made her point through action, rather than repetition. Thomas Monroe was at the table. Caleb came in from the yard, having apparently decided breakfast was a reasonable reason to stop working. Through the window, the north section was visible, the Callaway roof that had been fixed on the left side. The Harding children running the property boundary that Eleanor had taught them that morning. The fence line that James had assessed on his first day and that had been maintained now through 2 seasons. The table filled. The sound of it was the same sound it had been on the first evening James had sat at it as someone else when he hadn't known who these people were, or what they were building, or what it would mean to become part of it. He knew now. Thomas Monroe passed the bread. Caleb and Eli started an argument about the Eastfield drainage that would not be resolved before the meal ended. Mrs. Haynes sat because Eleanor had months ago told her she was eating at the table and not in the kitchen, and that this was not something Mrs. Haynes got a vote on, which Mrs. Haynes had objected to and then complied with and now would not have changed. Eleanor ate. James watched her eat with the satisfaction of a man who has seen a particular cost and is paying attention to it. She caught him watching and gave him the look, the slightly exasperated, entirely warm look of a woman who has accepted that this person is going to notice things about her and has decided she can live with that. "The north field," she said. "After breakfast." "I'll bring the drainage notes," he said. "Bring Caleb," she said. "He's been watching the water table in the lower section, and he has better data than either of us." Caleb looked up from his argument with Eli. "I've been saying that for 2 weeks." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'm saying it now, so eat faster." The table laughed. The morning went on. Outside, the Virginia summer held the land in its full warmth, and the Monroe program at Clover Hill went on becoming what Eleanor Monroe had decided it would be, long before anyone else could see it. Not because the world had made it easy, not because anyone had handed it to her, but because she had known exactly what it was worth. And she had built it anyway in the dark, before anyone was watching, the same way she had always done everything that mattered. And this time when she looked up from the work, someone was there. Not watching her. Standing beside her. And that in the end was everything.